So with a focus on side bending and twisting, we're going to start with a few moments just to map out the spine. So what I would recommend here is taking a blanket and opening it to about this dimension. So you've got something opened wide and loose. And then from there, depending upon the thickness of your blanket, you can do that zigzag fold a few times. The only thing that needs to be accounted for here is that this is as long as your spine. So if you happen to have like a smaller blanket or it's really thick but not very long, you can unfold it, refold it, do a few moments of blanket origami, because we're creating basically a runway for the spinal column. So when you come down onto this, you'll have your sacrum at one end, and as you lie back, your head at the other. And as we're here for a few moments, we're not going to commit right out of the gate to any particular position or any preference in action. I just want you to come back with your knees bent, your feet on the floor, and your arms just out to the sides as though in a shavasana, and to get a felt sense of how you come into this reclining position. One of our best ways to take our attention and to redirect it inwards is to notice the rise and fall of the breath. And that is always such a useful tool in our yoga practice, but especially so when we're thinking about anything in the neighborhood of the core. Of course, the spine is part of that core discussion. And so as you take a few moments to breathe here, gently lengthening both inhale and exhale, notice if your breath is a felt experience, a movement, pressure, a touch between your body and the blanket. Of course, you may feel your breath arriving to and departing from many other places, but is there any felt impact between your breathing and that track of the blanket from skull to sacrum? And as we often note, it might be that through the duration of our sequence in this class, that your breath does not come as easily and freely as it does when you're reclining back in a posture of relaxation. And that's an expected and a good outcome. But while you have this moment of simplicity in position, really not a lot of action going on right now, just focusing in on your breath, it might be sweet to really expand the length of that inhale and the exhale alike. So maybe just for, say, 2, 3, 4 cycles, can you touch into not just your longest breath, but your comfortably longest breath? And again, not just stretching the inhale and exhale for its own sake, but noticing the way that that may impact the track of blanket along your spine. All right. Let's begin to involve a little bit more detail here. So I'd like you to notice while you're here for another couple of moments, what your habits and tendencies are along that spinal column. And let's start at the top. We often start at the bottom, but it's good every once in a while just to kind of redirect the details. So as you're here, can you perceive if you are tilted more towards the top of your head? That would be with your chin high. And if that is, happening in any measure, could you from here roll so that you're more on the back plane of the skull and one way to mark that would be that your chin comes a little lower down towards your chest. And, I'd wager that each and every single one of us has to do that with a slightly larger dosage of movement than we might assume. We live in almost a perpetual forward head posture. And part of that is like jutting the skull to look upwards or forwards in most cases. But as you're here, could you imagine like pushing the back of your skull up that blanket, lowering the chin down towards your chest? I find it especially difficult to do that and speak. And hang out there for a moment with a pretty determined neutral skull neck relationship. I also put into this a little pressure back with my head. So once I lower my chin, once I lengthen the top of my neck, I then actually push my skull back as almost just to seal it into position. And it might be that as we travel down the spine, the previous point falls by the wayside. Capture what you can. We already know that perfectionism is not where we're headed. So we take a good long look, and it might be that every once in a while we accept that what we created a second ago is hard to attain as we layer on ever more complexity. All right, so next stop along the journey from skull to sacrum would be somewhere in the middle of your upper back. And I'm going to think about the space between my shoulder blades as being my best landmark. Does that work for you? Do you need to think of some other point in that thoracic spine? I would suggest between the shoulder blades because it's sort of like you could give your scaps like a little wiggle jiggle and maybe even identify that pretty dull area of the upper back a little bit more clearly. Now, as you're here, could you imagine that that space between your shoulder blades is in fact just that much more in connection with the blanket? So just the way that we thought of a moment ago, of like actually nudging the skull back, could you actually press the back of the heart just oh so slightly more firmly into that blanket? Does that adapt, change, shift the position of your rib cage? I bet it would. And what I'm thinking of primarily here is that if you tend to lie back with your ribs sticking up to the ceiling, this is going into the back of the body and saying, pressurize here, see if that takes those lowest front ribs and brings them more compactly down to your organs. All right, we got skull, we got upper back between the shoulder blades. Let's travel on down to the sacral area. So here, and it's a very, very common outcome. I would say like if I were standing in a classroom full of say 20 people, a good 20 of them would have had their tailbone tucked as those other points were investigated. Well, it helps facilitate a couple of those points we made, but it's not a neutral spinal position. So let's just try to see if we can keep skull neutral, back of the heart in connection, and then roll to the lower half of your sacrum. For many, many, many people, they would report, oh, it feels like I'm arching my back off the floor. It feels like I'm like sticking my tailbone back to whatever is behind me here, of course, the blanket. And that is precisely what we're aiming for. If you overcook it, then you end up with those lowest front ribs one more time picking up off of the blanket. So can you press that lower half of the sacrum down into the blanket? Appreciate that your waistband, your low back might be light or unconnected from your blanket. And then as you zip back up the spinal column, could you press the back of the heart? Could you lower your chin and press the back of the skull? And as you stay for a couple more breaths here, notice if this has in fact changed your access to your biggest, longest, slowest breath. And I suspect that it has, and I suspect that it should, in spite of the changes and the shifting of pressure around the abdomen as we did this spinal awareness. What about your breath? Could you still breathe well? I bet you can. All right, my friends. So whatever you just, pushed into being, you can hear, let it all hang out. Take a moment. You might have like a little twist in mind, a little knee down position to one side, whatever you might like. But our next stop is to turn from our backs to our sides. And we're going to come into a side lying position now. I always pad this up because we'll be on an outer hip, we'll be on an elbow. And for myself, I don't want to add any more suffering. So a little padding is nice. All right. So as we come to side lying, let's lie on the right side. I've lined up my blanket towards the back edge of my mat, the far edge of my mat from the camera. And when I come down to this, I'm going to park that outer hip bone called the trochanter, part of the femur, and my elbow on that same line. And so in this fashion, I know that I'm not like stuck in my perpetual fetal position. I'm not hunching and rounding my spine, but essentially I'm all lined up. Theoretically, I'm never quite. And as we take a moment here, your knees can be in a bend, your legs can be stacked. What's going on down there, like how far open or closed, is not really vital to this, but find a comfortable position. And then as you start, just let this left hip hike up, squeeze up into the left waist. Right? This is like, we sometimes nickname this like your your supermodel pose. So as you have this, it's a very casual lounge. But what I'm thinking of this, because we're not posing for a photograph necessarily, is that we are doing a side bend where we close up this hip to rib space on the left waist. And consequently, we get a long stretch on the opposite side, right? So you can kind of envision here, my spine is in a crescent shape. Then we're going to think about pulling that hip away from the waist. And you can appreciate here, I'm sure, that we have now lengthened left waist, lifted right waist away from the floor. And as we give this a moment of consideration, we'll just get a sense. You might feel, of course, pressure on that trochanter, pressure on the elbow. That's, and the outcome of leaning over sideways. But also notice if you can like attune to some sort of like, oh yeah, I have to use my core. This isn't the strongest core move you can do, but it's in there. And then let's go through that a couple of times. So you're side bending, you're neutralizing the side bend. And, if you're sensitive as I am on that outer hip, you can probably feel your pelvis in motion, right? Because that bone, it doesn't love to have a lot of firm pressure. So it gives you a signal of like, hey, what's going on down there? And then again, we're going to lengthen out so that left waistline, right waistline, almost equal length. I'm sure we're still in something of a side bend. Then let's place here left hand to heart, and just know that your head's going to peek around. If you're like me, you're always putting your head forward, especially when I'm teaching. I'm squinting at my screen. So I'm going to back up my skull, so ear over shoulder over elbow or thereabouts. And then we're going to twist. And you can certainly turn your head, but I'm having you keep left hand to heart, for I wouldn't want you to mistake this sort of wiggle jiggle for a spinal twist. So it's not a matter of like, can I reach over, pull back in? Can I put my hand down, pick my hand up? It's really from that space between the shoulder blades so stiff that we rotate and then open back up. And as you go through a few more, again, this is not done with that big scrunch in the waist. You're going to keep that side of the waist long, rotate down, face back open, rotate down, and face back open, and keeping that lower body stable. All right, back up and let's swivel around and do our second side. So again, lining up so that as we develop this felt sense of what a side bend is, of what a twist is, we've sort of excluded other movements from it. Not that that is a safety precaution. It's not. Most of your movements that you're going to make for the rest of your life are very complex mishmashes, side bend, flexing, some extension on one part of the spine, flexion on another, lateral movement, rotational movement. So we take time in our yoga practice to kind of parse these apart and to examine them as disparate pieces, knowing that that's a temporary experiment. Right, so as we come onto the left side, hip, elbow, ear hole over the same line. And then you can start for a moment in just hiking up this hip towards the waist. There happens to be a lovely little stretch in there around my left obliques. I say lovely, but it's sort of like a burning lovely. Let's call it necessary. All right, and then a few times here, you are moving the pelvis to essentially mobilize the spine. You could also think of it in the opposite terminology, like you're moving your spine to roll the pelvis. But I really kind of feel like hiking that hip up is going to push my spine down, and then pulling that hip down is going to lift my spine up. And you got a couple more of those. Again, does that sensitivity on the trochanter, does it at least inform you of like pressurization, movement? If it's too much, of course, just lots of padding underneath that. All right, and then we'll end on a high note. So you're going to be pulling down on this right side of the pelvis to lengthen this right waist space, to lift the left waist space away from the floor, right hand to heart. And again, we're, immobilizing that arm, so to speak, so that we don't mistake this like shoulder hook as a spinal twist. So can you get heart plus sternum to face down to the crook of that inner elbow? And then roll yourself open, facing down. Roll yourself open. And always, I think, at least to me, of perpetual interest is the disparity in the movement from side to side. Well, I'm not one to advocate for good side, bad side, good twin, evil twin. But rather just to kind of get a sense of those interrelationships. Your body doesn't really operate in two different halves. So you don't really have a bad side. You might have a shoulder or a hip or a part of your back that develops sensation, pain, stiffness, extra mobility, you name it. But it's not really good or bad. I mean, pain is bad, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum. So as I look into this is my not so twisty side. It's like there's a stopping point where it's like, well, I guess that's it. But then, oh, I don't know, maybe just another degree or two will squeak out. It's in there, but it's stiffer. All right, so we did a few of those. Let's go ahead and come out of side lying, and we're going to make our way into an all fours position. What might you like to pad that up? Perhaps something for the knees. And as you situate yourself into that quadruped position, take a moment in time to establish that while you're here, those wrists are below shoulders, knees are underneath the hips. And that as you stabilize with what is a very, very, very commonly taught in my classes premise for movement, that you're not just heading there like la-di-da, we always end up here, but instead that, again, you can develop a sense of your spinal column. So I tend to be sway backed. My spine's pretty curvy in and out. It's also long. Some people are just flatter from, north to south, skull to sacrum. Others of us will actively turn the tailbone under because it makes us feel like, okay, I've got some stability. So see if you can experience like just lengthening out that spine. It's not a total lift of the tailbone for that will make your sway back appear. And it's in the middle of that versus the big tuck under where you're like squeezing low belly and squeezing hammies. So tailbone pointing back, low back swoops in, upper back has a slight curve out, but we don't need to amplify that. So just pull the sternum forward and nudge the crown of your head across your space. I always think of those children's cone-shaped party hats with the terrible elastic string underneath your chin, that if you had one of those party hats on the top of your head, you could point your little horn an inch further out into space. All right, and then let's try this on for size. Let's place here the right hand to the back of the head, and I want you to push down and lift up that right elbow, right chest. Now, a lot of us end back here because it's hard to be on one hand and it's a lot of core strength to try to develop that twist while on an all threes pose. But see if you can come forward, vertical femurs, vertical supporting hand, and open on up. Then let's tap down that right elbow just to the inside of the left thumb. You may have to bend your left elbow by a little, or some of us even a lot, in order to make that connection. And then let's sweep up, open up, and then we'll tap back down a couple of times. So as I go into this, at the bottom of the movement, I know you can't see it on this side, but you'll see it on side two, my supporting elbow does bend a little bit. And as we go through the next couple of these, can you sense if you wag your tail off center, and can you keep here that right elbow, nope, the right knee, very firm to the ground. Didn't sound right when it came out of my mouth. So instead of leaning the hips over towards the left, if anything, lean your hips over towards the right. Let's open up one more time, and let's come back to our all fours. Take a pause, take a breath. Of course, we're going to do side two as we set this up. So we're going to bring here that left hand to the back of the head, and notice from the get, if as soon as a hand comes off the floor, if you park it way off to one side, and that's great. It's probably efficient for you on some level, but I think of it as a workaround. So as we work here to think about rotation, side bending, it's not just how stretchy can we get with those moves, but how much strength we can get. So we're going to lift up that left elbow and just make sure you're not wagging your tail one side or the other. And then let's tap down, and here it is. When I come down with my elbow to the inside of my right thumb, my right elbow does bend a little bit, but it's not like a total drop to the ground. So as much as I can, I'm pressing in my right hand so that I can open up a twist. Let's do a few, as always, in non-determined number, but enough to get there. And you can always add a couple to a side that feels like it's really going to benefit. You can always shave off a few if it is an excessive struggle. Or you can be a real stickler and do the same amount on each side. All right, one more time open for me. And as we linger on that last one, opening up again, just notice if you like swing your hips out of the way. One side, the other. Do you lift a shin? Is a foot unplug? And can you just stay even, squared over your all threes? And as you're here, just make sure you're not sitting way back. And then let's level off. And let's take a moment. We're going to find, well, I think honestly, a blanket is a best prop for a lot of us. I like a block, and I think that's something to do with like, I have long limbs. So if you try out a block and you're like, no, then just go to something flatter, like a folded blanket. But let me show you where that's going to be so you can make a choice about that. You're going to have a lift, a shim underneath your, let's start on the right side, right hand. Again, I'll go for a block. You might go for a folded blanket. And when you put this together, try to keep the heels of your hands in line with each other. Sometimes I see people put like the funky arm, the lifted arm forward, which I think at the end of the day doesn't actually get us where we want to go. So we're going to have the hands in line with each other. Right hand is on a lift of some height. And as you're here, again, notice if you are inadvertently swinging the hips one side or the other, press the tops of the feet down, press the shins down. And then from here, let's find a few cat and cows. If you come up with a lift for that right hand, and then you have to bend your elbow quite a lot, you probably just need a lower object, because what tends to happen is then we're like practically even with the shoulders again. We want here a distinct lopsidedness in that upper back, also known as a twist. We'll get a couple more in. And the next time that you're rounding your back, which we nickname cat back, big spinal flexion, tuck your chin, push your hands down, make sure that you are not drifting off the hands or away from that asymmetry. Again, this lift, the shim underneath the right hand is highly editable. It could be really any object. So make sure that you can stay four square. And then let's lengthen out, level off, and then come to side two, hands in line with each other. If that lifted hand goes further forward, you're reducing how twisted you are in your upper back. You can see here that when I get both elbows straight, shoulders over wrists, that my left side is higher than the right. And it's not just like I'm pushing the shoulder up, it's actually a twist. My heart center is facing a little bit into that leftward direction. And then we keep the legs anchored and we head to a set of cat and cows so that we can do what is, for many of us, a well-worn movement, like a beloved sweater, but this time with a new accessory to it, which is that upper back rotation. And this gives my shoulders something to think about. So while we're naming it by the fact of what the spine is doing, these things don't happen in isolation. They don't operate in a vacuum. I'd have to say my left shoulder blade thinks this is a pretty interesting thing. All right, we've done a few. Let's set that to the side. And then from here, let's find our way to downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. And for many of us, we use this as sort of a home base to kind of check in with a few points in our physicality. So if there's something that you go to assess, feel, find, organize your practice, spend a moment with that. And when you're ready to join me, let's do this with well-lifted heel bones. So heels as high as they get. And as you have those heels uplifted, note if you tend to bow at the ankles, like they roll away from each other like you're bow-legged, but at the ankles, not knees, or knock the ankles in, again, kind of like what your knees were do where you knock-kneed, but at the ankle joints. And can you keep those heel bones well lifted and stabilize the ankles so that they are quote unquote straight? They're not bowing apart or knocking in. And as you have your heels well lifted, stretch those legs to straighten them, push your hips up higher, and drag those collarbones along the floor as though to park them several inches closer to the tips of your toes. And then let's look forward, take a hop, step, leap, stroll, and let's lift up into our half forward bend as you come to the head of your mat. And then let's come up to standing. So let's include a chair for a few ideas here. And always accounting for the differences between proportions, height, mobility, but then also just equipment. So if you have a very different object than I have, then I trust that you can do your own amount of improv to make that happen in a useful manner. So you're going to put your chair at the head of your mat, have the seat facing in. Generally, the best idea is to have all 4 feet on the floor, unless we're pushing it. And then I'd like you to come again to a half forward bend. This time your hands come to the surface of the seat. And adapting as necessary, but could you here come to your right elbow with a straight or straight-ish left elbow? And if this is like, no, not even close, then do you have a block, a blanket, a something that could act as sort of a spacer between your elbow and the surface of the chair? I'll go without, but feel free to slide something in. All right, let's come back onto that right hand. Left elbow either direct to the surface of the chair, and I'd say elbow and hand in line with each other, elbow and wrist. let me say that differently. Your left elbow in line with your right wrist, just about in line with one another. And as you press down into that right side, again, can you get the right elbow straight or straight-ish? And use this to turn your heart in towards the right side. Now notice if those shoulder blades, as we always do a double check on these sorts of things, are they coming up towards your neck? And on this accounting, that might be because this is just a funky thing for your shoulders. So again, use a lift of any height if that gets you the better outcome, especially on something like the neck and shoulder area. All right, back to our hands, and then let's hold on to the sides of the seat, thumbs on top, fingers curling underneath, and then take a couple of steps back. This is not your longest dog in reference to the distance between hands and feet. It's a little bit more conservative. The idea being is that instead of your feet going back, your hips go back for miles. And as you lean your hips back, we're developing a grip on the chair, a sliding back of the pelvis, and from hands to hips, that's elbows, shoulders, and then that whole beautifully complex chain of bones called the spine, we're looking to create an amount of traction. And as you take this for a moment, let's come back and notice your access to breathing. You were breathing, and you were breathing enough, but yoga techniques coax us to include a longer breath from time to time to see if we can maintain an internal spaciousness while we're working on the outer body. All right, friends, let's come forward with the chest and shoulders. And then once you have your hands, your shoulders over your hands, let's walk the feet well back, coming into a plank pose from a grip on the chair. And I want you just to kind of feel your weight and get your bearings on this one for a moment in time. And then move the hips back, be able to get the heels to the ground. So briefly back to a downward dog, and place your right palm onto the seat of the chair. Your left hand can maintain its grip. And then let's come forward again. And because you probably walked in to get your heels down, we're going to walk out to get the feet behind us. And again, it's a plank pose, but can you feel a side plank on the way? So begin to turn onto the outer edge of the right foot, then step the left foot on top, stacking your 2 feet. From here, when will it be easy, simple, convenient to get that hand from the chair? Well, if it doesn't feel to be convenient, you could certainly keep your hand down. That actually puts you into a kind of an interesting twist. But when you can come up, well and good. And let's think about that side bend we did earlier from side lying, where it was sort of like we could like shorten the top waist. Let's lengthen that top waist, push this waistline upwards. I've got my hand there, so I've got something to like find. All right, hand comes down, dial the feet around, and you can have here that left hand on top. Right hand takes the side of the chair grip. It's a temporary holding place, but it's a nice one to develop steadiness. We come forward, shoulders over wrists, and then move your feet back and back and back and back. Turn onto the outer edge of the left foot, stack the right foot, shoulders are over wrists, and then from here, turning that right hand off of the chair and into that right waistline, and pushing upwards with that waist. Not to find something like where you begin to lift the hips so much you're no longer shoulder over wrist. We have shoulder over wrist and we're pushing that top waist upwards. All right, return your grip or hand rather to the chair. You can dial the feet around, and this time let's walk on in our half forward bend. And then lifting yourself upright. Let's turn the chair around. So if you're using something like a tall ladder back or a dining room chair that has a different sort of framing, make do, make do. I like this one. You could always scurry over, if it's convenient, to your kitchen sink and hang on to the inside of the sink. But this is just a little higher than the seat, and you're going to bring the heels of your hands to the back of the chair. And really, you can think of this as a downward dog, but a lot of yogis would say, oh, that's not really like a dog pose because you're not in like an upside down V, you're more in a right angle. And true that, but it's got like a dog element, like you want to push your hips back while your hands stay secure. And note that I'm not grasping the chair like it is a grocery cart. My fingers are extending past. All right, so can you devise this 90-degree forward bend, arms in overhead flexion, and pull your hips back. Then let's leapfrog the right hand on top of the left. So the left hand didn't go anywhere, but the right hand came on over. And yes, your noggin might get in the way, so you could lift up versus dipping down. And push your hips back here, and then pull your right hip further back. Another way of saying that is take that left hip into the waistline. So like a hip hike on the left. But try not to wave the weight off of, what would we do? Off of the right foot. Try to keep that right heel down, left heel down, right heel down, and pull that right hip back. All right, and then from here, you can relieve yourself of the hip hike, side scrunch. Right hand goes to its corner, left hand leapfrogs over, 2 straight arms, and then just go straight back. I mean, this already on my tighter left shoulder, it is a stretch. Then we're going to add to it that side bending for the low back. So you're going to push back that left hip, left waistline growing longer. Hike up the right hip, right waistline growing longer. And try not to shift the weight way off to one foot. We're trying to stay, I don't know, how would you say, centered, level, balanced over the legs, though you are doing a purposeful side bend. All right, and then you can point the tailbone just straight back. Left hand sneaks back to its corner. You can begin to raise your chest and take those few steps to come in and up out of our half forward bending. And then from here, we're going to face the chair forward. And this too is a moment where you can edit based on your proportions. So being on the taller end of the spectrum, the chair could be a little taller, but since it's not going to grow, what I do is I tend to put a blanket or two on top of the seat, and that lifts it up. And again, let me show you where we're headed so you can make a few choices about this. It's going to be a couple of sideways facing standing postures, and my main idea here is that when you come over into this, so we'll drop down blocks like we might normally for the wide facing poses. The idea is that the chair is going to, I don't want to say take care of it entirely, but take care of it mostly, of the stability of the lower body, so that above that, you really get to explore like great big gestures. So I'm coming to the front edge and I might shift around like 101 times. It's going to be right foot forward. So I've swung my right thigh off to the side and then left leg back. And here I go, shifting, shifting. So if this wide angle is just very difficult for you, you can angle the chair so that instead of going over the whole width of the seat, you're only going over the corner, then there's a back frame to contend with. I don't mind having to straddle this whole seat, so I'm content with that. I'm not going to spend much time on really trying to get my knee to point exactly to the side. My hip socket will never do that. And the harder I try, the more harm that I do. And then for some of us, because this is such a wide stance, your ankle is then going to be like what do you expect me to do? I can't get the heel down. If that is true, you can rest on the inside of the foot. You could bring that foot forward. I know it's a little off camera, but now I have my toes kind of pointing forward here because I know for a lot of us, this is like a big deal for the hips. So in regards to the height I've placed on the chair, that's because if I take this out, I don't have any clearance. Like I just feel like I'm stuck on the chair. I end up tucking my tailbone. It's just too short for me. So if you come over this and you're like, your feet aren't on the floor, then go lower. And for a lot of us, if we back towards the left foot, like if you park your pose off the left edge, that's going to be a little bit more comfortable on those strong yet tender inner thigh tendons. So all of that to say, those are a few ideas about how we sit across a chair. And I'm going to trust that you've got something you can play with. And then from here, we'll basically make it a Vera 2 for a moment. And as you're here with your Vera 2, instead of having any sort of helicoptering so that you're facing in the direction of your right knee, we're going to face directly off to the side with our shoulders and rib cage. It might be that your pelvis is corner-wise. It might be that your legs are closer towards the front than way off to the sides. And that's totally fine. You just need to adapt to this. However, up above, once you have this solid support, can you really figure out like the freedom of the spine in this posture? All right, we're going to reach over and over and over. And then I've got a block on its tall side. And then from here, sometimes people go really like bizarro with this. So I'm going to try to say it as clearly as possible. Like I just thought of like 7 different people who whenever they reach back, they do this big like double internal rotation. So what I want you to do is just to stick your arms straight out to the side. And then can you point back? Like you can see, I'm trying to point over my bolster and my peonies. And then I'm going to drop that hand down, fish around for some corner of the chair. You know, I could even hang on to the blankets underneath me. And I know you can't see where I'm grabbing, but that's not really that dreadfully important. You just want to reach back, lower your hand down, grab something, push your right hand down, probably onto a pretty tall block, and use all of that to begin to open your chest. So side angle pose, Utthita Parshvattanasana, generally not many people's most favorite beloved standing asana. I happen to like it, but I can understand that it's just so much like quad strength, like straddled position that it's like, what spine? Like just get me out of the leg tension. But as we take another couple of breaths, can you experiment with that open chest? All right, let's come up and let's use the chair one more time on this side. And then this time, what I'd like you to do is just hang on to the back of the chair. So again, I'm not like it's not like I'm putting on like a tight cardigan or like a tailored wool coat. I just have my shoulders back and I'm just grabbing. So I happen to have the frame of the chair in my hands, but it could really be any part. And as I take this, now I'm just going to slide my hand down and show you where I'm at, or can I? I'm sliding my hand down the chair. Maybe that's not that visible. And so instead of reaching for a block, I'm actually hanging on just above the foot of that back leg of the chair. And here I have my hand a little bit more towards the top corner of the chair. We do need a 7-person camera crew to get all the good angles, but short of that, I try to be succinct and descriptive. Grab the chair, twist. Right, and then let's come all the way on up. So side 2, if you need a little break, you just come to sitting facing forward, give yourself an inhale, exhale. If you found that on pass number 1, the block was too low, grab your second block, do a double stack, and you're taken care of. You could be very different from one hip to the other. So again, the height that you use is mostly in reference to like how long your limbs, but as we take our straddle across the chair, you can straddle across the whole distance of it, or you could pivot the chair so you're only straddling a corner of it. I'm not spending much energy or action on trying to crank the legs back or to point this knee even further open. My hip sockets do not forgive that very easily, and I am not the only one. So since we're on the chair, there really isn't a lot of cueing that I'll give about like level your pelvis because there's a pretty unyielding object underneath. So as you have this, we're kind of like, we designed a platform. I bet we designed a bespoke platform. You're probably not doing it the same way I am, and that is perfection. And then from here, as those arms come up, we have the ability to mobilize the upper body. Can you imagine if I had you in Warrior 2 without the chair and I had you here for these dreadfully long minutes and I was having you move your spine? Most people would like scrunch their neck, but here you get to like helicopter that chest, helicopter open. So square your chest, your ribs, your collarbones, your shoulders towards the long edge of your space. And then we reach over, let's include the block on version 1. And as we're here, we'll try not to do a big like mega twisty. Can you just, this is a different style of shoulder opening. Can you just reach back? You can see it's like I'm pointing to my door and then drop the hand down. Oh, what do I get over here? Like a little corner of the frame. I feel the fringe on the blanket too. And I'm just rolling my fingers underneath a little lip of chair. And then with that, grab just behind me and my hand on the block. Let's use the two to open up the chest, to open up the spine. Again, access to this not so easy if we're in a side angle without all this support. So the standing posture's so good for so many things. But if we get tangled up around the hips and legs, and they do require stamina, it's hard to really access the big expression of the spinal column. All right, let's come back up and let's just do a second pass at that. We could call it a deeper version. So we're going down a little lower. If you love the block, keep it, keep it. Otherwise, we come back to something of a Warrior 2. We'll take the hands down and we're gonna slide down the back of that left leg. That's the way we entered it on side 1. I don't think it was. We're gonna grab the chair first. That's what we did. It's feeling a little disorganized. And then as you're here, you're sliding your hand down that back left leg. Your right hand is already behind you. Again, where you end up grabbing your chair, your object, your something, we'll just take it. And it's to have the arms behind us. And with like a little grab and reach, with a little push-pull power, can we use that again? Open the chest. Turn that top shoulder back. Lengthen from navel to heart. All right, and then let's bring ourselves back up, back up, back up. Again, let's take a break from those big stretchies and take a couple inhales and exhales here. And it's a sitting mountain pose. So as you take a few breaths, can you climb up the mountain of Tadasana along that spinal column? All right, so another orientation on the chair, last thing on the chair here. Again, it might need to be edited to adapt to what you can come up with. Again, and I'll just think long legs on this one. I'm going to straddle the chair going across it this time. So, well, I guess it's both across. But as I come to this, it's like I'm facing more to the short end of my space. Think of it as in the neighborhood of a Warrior 1. Now, a lot of us will say like front leg, torso, okay, got it. But the back leg is just being asked to do something really bizarro. So different than we might do on a standing pose, you could perhaps come onto the top of your foot and let that knee point down towards the floor. So it doesn't have to be a Virabhadrasana 1 duplicate, because for a lot of us, self included, that's just going to be too weird around the hips and low backs. It's going to lock down any other movement. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep like a long leg behind me. I'm on the top of the foot because if I tuck the toes, that's too much hip extension. It puts it into my low back. Surely I'm not the only one with that. So I've got kind of like a foot down lunge and then a regular bent knee in front. Same idea. If going across the entire width of the chair is too much, turn it on an angle so you're only going across the corner of it. You have a free right hand, and I bet that can find a pretty solid grasp on the pose, on the chair. And that grasp will actually do you a ton of work in bringing the left ribs forward. Again, because we're on the chair and it just sort of frames out the legs, it's hard to find a lot of adaptation after that. We're not concerned about exactly squaring the pelvis. P.S. We never are. But could you swing those left front ribs forward? And then could you add your left hand to the chair and back up your right hand? So as you hold on to the two sides of the chair with your two hands, can you use this to bring yourself upright and to rotate? And then let's inhale, exhale, face back to the right. Whatever your shenanigans that back leg was in, you can come off of that. Again, just take a moment to recenter, reconsider. Do you want to pivot that chair so you're just straddling the corner of it? Can you tolerate straddling the whole length of it? I keep saying that because I think it matters. Not because I'm short of things to consider. But for a lot of people, it's like, sweet, a chair practice. And then we get into it and it's like, my hips are dying. I don't know how to do this. I'm stuck. And we want the chair to like open a door, not close one. So as we pivot around, left leg, I think for most of us, we can come up with a fairly contented lunging position. That back right leg, I can do this for a hot second, but after a while, that hip just says no way. So what I'm going to do is kind of pivot around, make it more of a lunge. And rather than being on my back toes with the knee lifting, which is going to be great the day we work on back bends specifically, I'm going to be a little bit more neutralized in that right side low back, come onto the top of the foot. Bring your left hand around the chair in some way so that you can use this to wrangle that rib cage to face into the short end of your mat. And again, never really concerned on the exact squaring of a pelvis. And then can you find more rotation, which would probably be assisted by taking your hands and hanging onto the framework of your chair. If you have to lean way forward to get there, can you bring yourself up by any amount and use those powerful hands and arms to develop more rotation? So a few of our classic standing asana that include side bending and rotation in different and varying amounts. But being able to perhaps experience that a little bit more fully when we eliminate the drudgery of having to stand in these asana for minutes on end. All right, let's roll our way out again. Give yourself pause at center. Just find here a few inhales and exhales. And then when you're ready to come up, we try to make this like a useful transition, no hands. Hands come to prayer, back your heels underneath you, but keep your heels on the ground. And can you pour the weight of your torso over your thighs and knees? Can you then come up to stand? All right, so good with our chair. Unless you love legs on a chair for a shavasana, you can otherwise set this aside. All right, and then we are going to come on down. So let's use a blanket for the back of the head. As you recline, think of this as a very minimalist pillow. Have the edge of it just skim across the base of the skull. And then knees bent, feet on the floor. And returning to similar work, we're heading to Shavasana, so I'm not including that long fold blanket along the spine, but I have had people who just think that is so delightful for a good rest. So if you liked that, slide that back in. Otherwise, what I want us to consider here is that lengthening at the very top of the neck. Can you lower your chin to your chest? And then Secure that by pressing your skull just gently down to the ground. And then between the shoulder blades, the back of the heart, can you hear as well? Compress that down to the ground. For a lot of us, that's a catch 22. It's like, well, I did this, but oh, you actually wanted that. It becomes very idiosyncratic. It's like one thing undoes the other, but then you have to go back and do the first thing, and then it just keeps on like flip-flopping back and forth. But inside of yoga, that's not really considered to be a problem, right? Like that's just sort of like, oh, that's your work. That's what you're working on. So as you press the back of your heart to the floor, did you do that via tucking your tailbone, squeezing your buns, squeezing your pelvic floor, and smushing your low back flat to the mat well? Lengthen the top of the neck, tuck the chin, press the head back, press the back of the heart to the ground, but shoulders don't have to freak. And then from here, rolling onto the lower half of your sacral bone and pressing that to the ground. So 3 points that create actual pressure from body to floor. Could you imagine like a heat map? If you were to swiftly roll off of your yoga mat, would you see that these 3 points, lower sacrum, back of heart, back of skull, would leave just like a warmer imprint into your mat? Right? This is an arrangement, it's an action, it's a position. As you lengthen out your legs, relieve yourself of those actions. If there are other points that you would put in of support for your Shavasana, by all means, take your time to do so. And as you know, in our online classes, I only reserve a couple minutes for rest. And you have the option in your own time and space, according to your inclination and the availability of your own time for rest. Could certainly set up something more deluxe and for a longer duration. Otherwise, I will be silent for a couple of minutes, and the next time you hear me speaking, we'll come out to close together. Feel free to linger longer as your day permits. Otherwise, if you are concluding with me, a few breaths. Turning from your back to your side, from your side to sitting. And a few sweet breaths here to recognize the outcome of your yoga practice and to foster an appreciation for the efforts applied to develop those appreciated outcomes. You can let me know if you have any questions, and I hope to see you soon.